Good morning. This is May 7th, 2020, and this is episode 30 of Transmission.
Hi, everybody.
And just for those who don't know us, I'm Mark Van Steenwyk. I'm the director of the Center for Prophetic Imagination in Minneapolis.
And I'm Daniel Wolpert, and I direct the Minnesota Institute of Contemplation and Healing, or MICA. And episode 30. Bum, bum, bum.
And that means that we've been in this pandemic for well over 30 days because we started this well into the pandemic and we don't do it every day. So,
right. And if we were experiencing exponential growth of transmission, just like the virus, this would be like episode 256,000.
Yeah, that sounds accurate.
Yeah, it's kind of like how 7 dog years for every 1 human year. So there's coronavirus episodes and then regular day episodes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Speaking of exponential, today we're talking about death.
Yes.
And it's interesting. I think we're going to contrast this, but like we did an episode a while back talking about how our society avoids death. But at the same time, that's true. Well, it's also true that we normalize death and act like death is no big deal in certain contexts. And so today we want to talk about the way in which our society, particularly maybe even our leaders, have just normalized this idea that, not even really, only 70,000 have died. It's not a big deal, really.
Well, yeah, I mean, and when you say maybe even our leaders, no, it is absolutely our leaders. I mean, at this point, the national pandemic response is a bunch of people are going to die and we don't care. And we need to get back to work. I mean, that's what Trump said yesterday. A lot of people are going to die. That's really sad. Oh, well, we got to get back to work. Mm-hmm. This is on the one hand because the national response has been clueless and they have no idea what they're doing and haven't been able to actualize any of the responses that actually would be helpful. And so now they've defaulted to this. But I think what's really interesting and important to realize is that this is an American habit, right? This is an American habit. The most prominent example of this has to do with gun violence. We have exactly the same response to the issue of gun violence. Mm-hmm. Oh, well, yeah, schools are getting shot up. Lots of people are killing themselves. There's nothing we can do about it. It's too bad. Thoughts and prayers. And, we've got to have our guns. It's the same exact thing.
I mean, it makes sense. I mean, when you start talking about deaths in any number larger than 10, besides people that you know immediately, it starts to become an abstraction. I don't know what the number is. And so it makes sense that people wouldn't feel like it's a big deal at a certain level. But it becomes really perverse when we are content with someone shrugging, saying, well, this is going to happen. Nothing we can do about it. Right. Just to throw up this comment real quick, check out Necropolitics. I don't know how to pronounce that name, if it's Achille or Achille Mbembe. But check that out. I'm assuming anything Gregory is recommending would probably be worth checking out.
Yes. And Gregory, is that a book, an article, a podcast? Sounds really good. Right. Necropolitics. That's exactly what this is, right? The politics of death. And again, if you think about American history writ large, we have been able to shut off psychically from our individual and collective consciousness the fact that the growth and development of our country has been at the expense of a lot of deaths. Mm-hmm. Right? A lot of deaths of Black people, a lot of deaths of Native people, a lot of deaths of brown people. What does it say here?
It says it's a book by a Cameroonian professor at Duke.
Okay.
So again, that book is called Necropolitics. It seems to me like one of the ways we normalize and minimize death is, I mean, I feel like the easiest way is to sort people into one of two categories. One is it's a sacrificial death, which we're really good at. We just create this heroic narrative. Mm-hmm. It's what we do with soldiers, to a way it's like, you know what, I didn't want them to die, but they died for the greater good. That's the same reason we give for why people working frontline jobs, why they're heroes for being willing to die. The other is they were going to die anyway category, right, which is also being used. Like most of those people who are sick were going to die anyway. Like right. We talked about this, was it yesterday, about pre-existing conditions, or they were already sick anyway, and how that just feels very Nazi-ish. Like, let's just get rid of the disabled because they're already not full anyways, fully people. Right. They're not complete. So it's sad, but you know, they're already they have one step out the door anyways.
Right. Yeah. And so again, it seems like psychically what's required for this, right, is that you create some sort of, and we talked so much about narratives and stories. So you create some sort of narrative and story that you place so much importance on that it really does not matter what else happens for you to achieve that story. And so again, you know, when we think about guns and the Second Amendment, I mean, having guns, having as many guns as you want, having any kind of gun you want is so important. Like, that freedom to do that is so important that it really does not matter what else happens. It really does not matter, you know, if kids get shot up in schools. It really does not matter, you know, if a black man goes jogging and a couple of white guys decide to just kill him. Doesn't matter. All of these things. And so then when, you know, we look at what has happened in Canada over the last couple of weeks, where they had somebody kill a bunch of people with a semi-automatic weapon, and they just said, no, that's not okay. And so now we're going to ban these assault rifles. But what we have done with many different things is we prioritize these particular stories. And so in this case, of course, and we've talked about this tons, what's being prioritized is the economy, right? And again, because our leaders have not been able to figure out how to keep people safe and do the economy, which is possible, and many other countries are in the process of figuring out. What our national leaders have not been able to figure that out. So then they're just like, okay, well, we've only got these two options: lots of death and unemployment, less unemployment, you know, or lots of death and less unemployment, or less death and more unemployment. And what's important is the less unemployment.
I mean, this is really deep in kind of the Western civilizational project. So like the movie Braveheart, I remember that movie, and they're at the point where the big battle is about to happen. I don't know if it's the Battle of Stirling or York. I can't remember which one. And, you know, William Wallace, face half painted blue, says they can take away our lives, but they can't take away our freedom. You know, it's like the give me liberty or give me death mentality. And so this idea is, hey, death, it happens all the time. But so now the government's talking about it as a way because they want to take our liberty. And, you know, those people would have died anyway. And there's something to that. Like the part of it to it is like the government, it's okay to be suspicious of the government, because the government, like 9/11, the whole reason we had freedoms taken away is under this idea that somehow it was safer for us. And so then they engaged in a bunch of security theater that doesn't really help, and then vilified Muslims and other foreign people that are foreign Muslims, and then local Muslims, you know, this sort of thing. And then, you know, you transport that logic. Okay, now it's not Muslims, it's a disease, and we're being kept safe. So it's like this sort of, it's easy to fall into this, like, this is just like before mentality. And it's insidious, but what it does is it invisibilizes the actual the actual deaths. It acts like it's no big deal, and
Mhm.
that your freedom is somehow more important, whatever you think that freedom is.
Yeah. So Gregory is
Yeah,
saying,
necropolitics is endemic to empire, and America, of course, is an
yeah.
empire.
Right, because so that an empire needs to grow, and it needs to take over, and it needs to enrich itself. And in order for that to happen, there have to be lots of people that are dying. There have to be groups of people, classes of people
Hmm.
that are dying, and whether that's very overtly through warfare and taking places over, whether that's less overtly through things like overworking people,
Hmm.
slavery, chattel, serfdom, paying people poor wages so they're poor and sick. Yeah, I mean that death is essential or comes hand in hand with extraction, right? So
Hmm.
extracting wealth, extracting materials,
Hmm.
and in this case, right, extracting jobs and gains in the stock market.
Yeah.
And and I think the other thing that this covers up, you're just talking about several of the things that this kind of covers up. The other thing that it covers up is really incredible incompetence.
Hmm.
Right. I mean, the reason, again, I think we need to be very clear that these are not the only two options, right? The jobs or health option duality is not real. I mean, that's not the that's not the only game in town. But we are being fed that line continually.
Yeah.
But again, our federal government has made a whole series of conscious choices, unconscious choices, basic, ongoing blunders
Hmm.
that is creating this reality. And so yeah, so it's this kind of fascinating mix of intentionality via the empire process, of cluelessness, of lack of caring, and unwillingness to do the hard work, right? To look at ourselves and to kind of do the hard work to create other choices.
Yeah, and just we're 12 minutes in, and if you're listening, feel free to share comments and questions. We love that. It's kind of why we're doing this, is to engage in conversation with y'all. Just going back to this, I think it's just really hard. I mean, we're already preconditioned to avoid death because, like you were mentioning, an empire and capitalism in general requires exploitation and injury and death. It has to do this to other people, and then it has to have stories for why that's normal. So it's a normalization of exploitation. And so when someone in China gets their fingers bloody from sewing together teddy bears, it's like, well, that's just how it kind of is. That's
Mhm.
that's the first step towards their own self-determination. Like that, we have these narratives that just make it all seem very rational.
Mhm.
And so that's just this an extension of that logic. Like people get sick and die, and just because we can count them now, I mean, they're inflating the numbers anyway. They're just telling us this. They're only caring now because there's something in it for them. They're sneaky and sinister about it. And again, like I get that suspicion, but then you have to jump over a whole bunch of science and start being okay with a whole lot of death really quick to get to this thing, because you somehow have been told that the only way you can have your freedom is if it looks a particular way and fits a particular story.
Mhm. Yeah, and what's also interesting, we've talked about this a number of times, and I feel like I continue to kind of see this interesting process where you can start with a grain of truth,
Mhm.
right? And then you spin it into this either diabolical or totally nonsensical explanation or set of actions, right? So for example, this whole thing of, well, 90-year-olds are going to die anyway. Well, that's actually true, right? Right? I mean, if you're 90 years old, each day you have an increasingly high chance of dying. You are obviously nearing the end of your natural life. And that's absolutely correct, right? So, but to then take that basic kernel and say, all right, therefore, it's fine to do all kinds of things in society that actually make it more likely that you're going to die from this illness, right? That's a conflation or a building onto this one basic fact that is incredibly unhealthy, right? But we see this happening all the time. I mean, we were just talking about some of the latest conspiracy theories that have been blowing up in these conspiracy videos. And if you listen to them, which I can't tolerate doing for very long, but if you listen to them, they often start with some sort of basic truth, right? Like, for example, they'll start with the immune system is important. Well, I mean, that's true, right? And then they may say something like, and our immune systems are sometimes need more support and aren't very well developed. Well, that's also true, right? And they then jump from there to, and therefore the coronavirus is a fake bioweapon from China, and the vaccine is going to have a microchip in it that is going to control your mind.
And that's also true.
Right, and that's also true. Right. All right. So, Greg,
the best lies have enough truth to conceal or obfuscate the lie.
Yep.
Yeah, and we've talked about conspiracy theories, and we'll probably engage them more. It's this thing, like, you want to make meaning of this situation, and you have your most important thing, and so you build a narrative around that most important thing, or receive that narrative, and anything that doesn't fit it, you kind of push aside. And then you don't question, like, the logic of it. So to me, the logic of you're 90 years old and you're going to die anyway, or these other people who are immunocompromised are going to die anyway, it's hard for me not to hear that as an ableist narrative, that some people are more expendable than others based upon how fragile they are, and that they're not needed for this economy, and it's usefulness for this economy that determines the fullness of your humanity. Like, that's the narrative I'm hearing, and no one really ever, some people do, but most people don't say that out loud. But I think it's part of the operative logic here.
Yeah. Well, and what's very I don't know even what the adjective is, but I mean, we actually are hearing people say that out loud.
We are hearing some people say that out loud. I think most people don't.
No, most people don't. But
yeah. And if you're hearing one of these people say that and you think, well, there's some truth to that, like, and I kind of see where they're coming from, like, check yourself and make sure that you're not, like, too sympathetic to this idea, because it just shows your condition. Like, most societies, every society doesn't do this. Like, there have been lots of societies when people are sick or elderly, they get taken care of and are treated with some honor. Like, it's not a foregone conclusion that we have to cull our weakest members to have a strong herd. It's not a foregone conclusion. It's not a foregone conclusion that taking care of them somehow takes away from your sense of freedom. Like, what is that freedom? Like, that's worth asking. Like, I tend to be an anarchist, so I'm totally against the government, like, oppressing people. But to me, my definition of government oppression is, like, I don't think I should just feel free to do whatever I want. And if somebody gets in the way of that, then I'm like, well, you should let these old people die. Like, that's not, that doesn't really enter into my thinking. Yeah. And Gregory talks about, again, eugenics. This is that old system of, like, those people are kind of a burden, and our society would be better if we didn't have that burden. Which is, again, this is the same logic.
So I feel like we've just depressed everyone. So
Carol writes, I want to have input into whether, when, and how it's time for me to die.
Yeah, and so I think that, Carol, this brings up a really important point, and again, this fine line between what is a healthy way of looking at these issues, and then what becomes a very distorted, unhealthy way of looking at it. So, I think that one of the reasons that it's easy to slip into this, oh, well, those folks are just going to die anyway, is that we actually do not have healthy discussions about death and dying, right? So So we do not talk about, and people are not empowered. Like that 90-year-old is not empowered by our society to talk about what is a good way to die. How do
No,
I want to die?
this is where it's ironic, right? Because
Right.
it's our avoidance of death that causes us to normalize death. And so
Yeah,
those are two ends of the extreme. It's either entirely normal as long as it's not me, or I'm going to avoid even thinking about death. Like I don't even want to see it or know about it. And then this whole middle of relating to death with open eyes and honesty and vulnerability, it's missing.
All right, so Catherine's got
Catherine has a great comment, as always. Working in a Norwegian nursing home in my early 20s while my grandma was dying in a badly managed American nursing home really impacted my thinking about death. I became intensely convinced that my 90-year-olds with memory loss had just as much value and deserved as much love and care as me, a healthy 20-year-old, and could have it in a well-functioning society. And I realized how much violent, casual ableism my society had taught me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's that. And then again, there is this, I mean, right now, if you go in to try to talk to your doctor or somebody about how you want to die, you are given a diagnosis of depression and you are encouraged to take psychoactive medications to stop having those thoughts. Right? Now that's completely insane. I mean, that's just insane, right? Every society, every traditionalist society, every ancient society has had a lot of conversation about what is a good death.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And we don't have that conversation. And so then we get stuck in these very twisted, weird conundrums.
Yeah, Deborah has a comment that it kind of demonstrates this. Respecting people who are old or compromised should be respected, but does not mean that our healthcare system should spend massive amounts of money to extend their lives when they are ill or injured. Better to help them with compassion. And this is complicated, and I could see people hearing that and thinking it's maybe heartless, but it's not. Like, to me, this is the thing. Like, our avoidance of death causes people to think that the best thing and the best common good is to have people live as long as possible under any conditions.
Right.
And to me, that's a part of the avoidance of death.
Yeah.
That's not compassion. That's like, that's fear of death. And then the flip side is this avoiding, like, is this normalizing it? Like, to me, compassion and presence is kind of the missing sauce.
Well, right. And, and that's why, I mean, in the spiritual life and tradition, right? So, for example, in Buddhism, the spiritual path has talked about this middle way, right? This middle way between nihilism and idealism, right? And so that idealism, in this case, would be this notion that we can live forever, and that's the best thing, right? And idealism is often as a certain type of avoidance of reality. And then nihilism is like, well, yeah, I mean, they're just going to die, whatever, but let's just kill them, let them die, and the spiritual path is the middle way between those two things, which is looking at reality with a very truthful, brave gaze, but also with a tremendous amount of compassion. Right? And it's that middle way that is so hard, particularly, and again, imperialist systems, and in our case, an imperial capitalist system, can't really do that, right?
No.
Carol's got some more comments here.
New York State recently passed law that allows the document permitting agent of stage 6 to 7 dementia patient to withhold food and water. Right. That sounds horrible.
Well, I think she's actually, I'm not sure she's talking about it as that's horrible.
I don't know.
Maybe.
I mean, withholding food, I guess I interpret it as withholding food and water as being a negative, but allowing someone to die with dignity is not. So I don't know enough about it that sounds bad to me. So maybe you can shed more light on it.
Yeah.
With COVID-19, the cost of I don't know what LTC is.
Long-term care.
Is going to skyrocket further.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess there's this tension. Like, my reaction to that being negative is, to me, it's this tension. Like, how do you care for someone well without just having people artificially kept alive in ways that is just stretching things out in a way that it does not affirming their full humanity and allowing full
Well,
presence in
and to
relationship.
me, this is one of the things about having these conversations, right?
Mhm.
That the way we should be normalizing death is not the way in which our capitalist empire normalizes it, as in it's okay to kill a bunch of people to get what we want. The way we should be normalizing death is to say that this is a normal part uh, of our experience as humans, and we need to be able to talk about it and work with it in a healthy way. Right?
Yeah.
And that's the way that normalizing death could be going on in a healthy fashion.
Yeah. So Carol writes, stage 6 and 7 is mental function of less than a 1 year old.
Yeah, right,
And again, this is stuff isn't talked about. This is stuff is tucked aside.
right,
When my mom was dying, we didn't even know how to talk about it.
right.
Right. And it used to be like in our society, I've talked about this before, probably in one of these transmissions, but there used to be, I still see a lot of old houses that have those double doors because the assumption was you could move a casket in and out of a house for a wake. And lots of funerals were not done in special homes where you just bopped in and out. There's a lot more time being spent with the body, a lot more time lingering over death and talking about how to process death. And so these sorts of conversations don't happen. And so then when someone is sick or dying, we don't know what to do. And so we kind of go with what the standard is, which is this sort of pathological avoidance of death,
Yeah.
not allowing people to die well.
Yeah, and so Karen here is mentioning the Oregon Death with Dignity law, yeah, which is one of the most really progressive laws trying to deal with these issues. And and so we just have a few minutes left, and so one of the things I want to I think just reflect on for a moment is again this question of, okay, so what do we do? What do we do in response to this current situation? So again, when we hear that, all right, so this is now federal policy, like as of yesterday, and I think they've been talking about it, behind the scenes for a bit longer, but as of yesterday, this is now essentially the federal policy that we are going to kind of let this thing run its course. States can have some authority about doing what they want to do with it, but basically, we want to open things up and let as many people die as die, and we just need to get going again. So, if we're now living in a society where that is the official policy, I think it's really important for us to recognize that and then decide in whatever sphere of influence we have how we are going to continue to function in a manner that is as healthy and compassionate as possible. Because honestly, I mean, I don't know how you all feel about that, but not only do I feel like that policy is horrible, but it's, reasonably scary. And so to say, all right, well, we need to be very awake about what we're headed into and how we're going to engage that context over which we have very limited power.
Mm-hmm. Karen writes that there are death cafes out here too.
Mm.
I'm assuming that's not a goth teenager hangout.
No, I don't think so.
Deathcafe.com. You can look at what Karen's talking about there. Do you know what that is, Dan? Death Cafe?
Well, I mean, I think it's like, I don't know 100%. My guess would be if it's connected to the Death with Dignity law, that it's actually places where you can go and die. And again, I mean, this is traditional societies have always had this. A number of traditional African societies, people would go out into the desert to die. Indigenous societies in the Arctic, people would get on an iceberg, go and die. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of this. Karen's got an article.
Yes, a link. I'm sure you probably want to start at the www.forbes.com, or just Google the how a 15,000-year-old human bone could help you through the coronavirus. I'm assuming that's giving information related to death cafes and death with dignity. To me, this is also just to talk about the Christian tradition. There's this, I mean, part of what Lent is about, So there's a reason people, when coronavirus is happening at the same time as Lent, people were talking about how this is Lent-like. And I don't know if that's a perfect fit, but the truth of it is Lent has traditionally been a time to contemplate one's own mortality,
Mm-hmm.
And relate to, like, what is it that I'm living for? What's my vocation? How do I live in identification with the death of Christ and the resurrection? And it's like this way of reorienting,
Mm-hmm.
not shying away from death, but looking at death in a way that's meaningful. I mean, even Jesus says, take up your cross. It's not like put up with difficult things. It was talking about how to embrace a type of death in a way on your own terms,
Mm-hmm.
for the glory of God, right? So, and I'm just reminded of a couple that I know that, every Lent or every other Lent, they talk about one of the practices, what would happen if they died and their children were left without parents. And so they make plans so that their family can flourish without them dying. And they just look death in the face and they talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
And they do this as a Lenten practice, as a way of kind of just accepting the possibility of death so that they're not living under the fear of death. Those sorts of practices seem really important, and we don't really nurture those.
Right. Yeah, and I think especially within the context of an empire that is in many ways very death worshiping, in this negative kind of way that we've talked about it, that to help us engage life in a positive way, to help us to go forward fearlessly, to help us to engage our fears, to help us make wise decisions.
Mm-hmm.
That we do have to look this reality of death kind of in the face, and engage it fearlessly, because our society is engaging it very casually,
And in a way that is terrified of death at the same time, which makes sense. I mean, because when you're overwhelmed, you become apathetic. And so usually apathetic people are overloaded. And so I feel like our culture has death overload and is therefore avoidant of it at the same time.
All right. Well, whew. That was brutal.
Tomorrow we're going to talk about puppies and gumballs.
Right. And actually, tomorrow we're not going to be on. I haven't told you this yet, Mark. Sorry.
What about our gumball and puppy conversation?
We can do that on Monday.
Yeah.
So we're not sure what we're going to do, but So we're giving you a 3-day weekend to contemplate normalizing death. And sorry. And then we'll be back with puppies and gumballs.
It's a gift to you.
And we love all of you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for watching.